Welcome to Lesson 6 of the online law course. We're going to finish the material that was assigned for reading for Lessons 5 and 6. Part of it we discussed in Lesson 5. We're going to discuss the last case here in Lesson 6. We're still dealing with the First Amendment. And this is one of these difficult policy cases that we get into. First Amendment scholars and the courts have recognized that once we have fuzzy lines, once we have gray lines saying that it's okay to censor some things, it's very, very difficult to decide where those lines stop. And in general, the courts in this country have said we are not going to allow censorship. Remember that this is a badly divided Supreme Court that often splits 5-4. In this case, they voted 8-1 to strike down a state law that was designed to protect kids from violent video games. And I was describing this case to my wife as I was working on putting this lesson together, and she said, well, that sounds like a good idea. Well, maybe it sounds like a good idea, but again, it's very difficult to draw those lines. Who are these people? The Entertainment Merchants Association, of course, represents the video game industry. Jerry Brown was the governor of California when this case got to the Supreme Court. As the case went up through the courts, it was actually called Schwarzenegger versus the Entertainment Merchants Association because Arnold Schwarzenegger, the Terminator, was the governor of California as the case went through the trial court and the Court of Appeals. But to give you a flavor of how the Supreme Court deals with this case, let's take a few minutes to listen to some of the questioning of the Assistant Attorney General who is arguing this case on behalf of the state of California.
This morning, California asked this court to adopt a rule of law that permits states to restrict minors' ability to purchase deviant, violent video games that the legislature has determined can be harmful to the development and
What's a deviant violent video game as opposed to normal violent video game?
Yes, Your Honor. Deviant would be departing from established norms.
There are established norms of violence?
Well, I think if we look back...
I mean, some of the Grimm's fairy tales are quite grim, to tell you the truth.
Agreed, Your Honor. But the level of violence...
Are they okay? You going to ban them too?
Not at all, Your Honor.
What's the difference? I mean, if you are supposing a category of violent materials dangerous to children, then how do you cut it off with video games? What about films? What about comic books? Grimm's fairy tales? Why are video games special? Or does your principle extend to all deviant, violent materials in whatever form?
No, Your Honor. That's why I believe California incorporated the three prongs of the Miller standard. So it's not just deviant violence. It's not just patently offensive violence. It's violence that meets all three of the terms set forth.
I think that misses Justice Ginsburg's question, which was why just video games? Why not movies, for example, as well?
Sure, Your Honor. The California legislature was presented with substantial evidence that demonstrates that the interactive nature of violent video games, where the minor or the young adult is the aggressor, is the individual acting out this obscene level of violence, if you will, is especially harmful to minors.
Well, do you actually have studies that show that video games are more harmful to minors than movies are?
Well, in the record, Your Honor, I believe it's the Gentile and Gentile study regarding violent video games as exemplary teachers. The authors there note that video games are not only exemplary teachers of pro-social activities, but also exemplary teachers of aggression, which was the fundamental concern of the California legislature in enacting the statute. So while the science is continually developing, indeed, it appears that studies are being released every month regarding
Suppose a new study suggested that movies were just as violent. Then presumably California could regulate movies just as it could regulate video games.
Well, Your Honor, there is scientific literature out there regarding the impact of violent media on children. In fact, for decades, the President, Congress, the FTC, parenting groups have been uniquely concerned with the level of violent media available to minors that they have ready access to.
I don't know, is that answering Justice Kagan's question? One of the studies, the Anderson study, says that the effect of violence is the same for a Bugs Bunny episode as it is for a violent video. So can the legislature now, because it has that study, say...
Now that you have a sense of how the court felt about this issue, it's interesting to look at their opinion. California correctly acknowledges that video games qualify for First Amendment protection. The court goes on. What is one man's amusement teaches another's doctrine. Like the protected books, plays, and movies that preceded them, video games communicate ideas and even social messages through many familiar literary devices such as characters, dialogue, plot, and music, and through features distinctive to the medium, such as the player's interaction with the virtual world. That suffices to confer First Amendment protection. Under our Constitution, aesthetic and moral judgments about art and literature are for the individual to make, not for the government to decree, even with the mandate or approval of a majority. And notice they're citing a case that involved Playboy Entertainment Group, publisher of a magazine that, when it first came out in the 1950s, was controversial because it showed almost nude women. Later, of course, it showed fully nude women. And whatever the challenges of applying the Constitution to ever-advancing technology, the basic principles of freedom of speech and the press, like the First Amendment's command, do not vary when a new and different medium for communication appears. Here's what the court had to say about kids and violence. California's argument would fare better if there were a long-standing tradition in this country of specially restricting children's access to depictions of violence, but there is none. Certainly the books we give children to read or read to them when they are younger contain no shortage of gore. Grim fairy tales, for example, are grim indeed. As her just deserts for trying to poison Snow White, the wicked queen is made to dance in red-hot slippers until she fell dead on the floor. A sad example of envy and jealousy. That's from the complete Brothers Grimm fairy tales. Cinderella's evil stepsisters have their eyes pecked out by doves. And Hansel and Gretel, these are children, kill their captor, a witch, by baking her in an oven. High school reading lists are full of similar fare. Homer's Odysseus blinds Polyphemus, the Cyclops, by grinding out his eye with a heated stake. The Odyssey of Homer. Even so did we seize the fiery pointed brand and whirled it around in his eye, and the blood flowed about the heated bar. And the breath of the flame singed his eyelids and brows all about, as the ball of the eye burnt away, and the roots thereof crackled in the flame. In the Inferno, literature from the 16th century, Dante and Virgil watch corrupt politicians struggle to stay submerged beneath a lake of boiling pitch, lest they be skewered by devils above the surface. And Golding's Lord of the Flies recounts how a schoolboy called Piggy is savagely murdered by other children while marooned on an island. And here's the knockout blow from Justice Scalia, who wrote this opinion. Of course, California has wisely declined to restrict Saturday morning cartoons, the sale of games rated for young children, or the distribution of pictures of guns. Justice Scalia had a good time talking about Saturday morning cartoons in this opinion, and they came up in some of the questioning that you heard. Let's take a look at one of my old favorite cartoons about the Roadrunner. For those of you who aren't familiar with this cartoon, the Roadrunner is a very fast bird And the problem that he faces in life is that Wile E. Coyote is constantly trying to catch him and, of course, wants to eat him. And it usually doesn't work out very well for Wile E. Coyote. And let's just take a look at one example of that. Yes, there is a lot of violence in cartoons, even in Bugs Bunny. Like the Roadrunner, Bugs usually comes out on top. Now, back to the slide that we left to look at the cartoons. And again, let's repeat that sarcastic sentence by Justice Scalia. Of course, California has wisely declined to restrict Saturday morning cartoons, the sale of games rated for young children, or the distribution of pictures of guns. The consequence is that its regulation is wildly under-inclusive when judged against its asserted justification, which in our view is alone enough to defeat it. Under-inclusiveness raises serious doubts about whether the government is in fact pursuing the interest it invokes rather than disfavoring a particular speaker or viewpoint. Here, California has singled out the purveyors of video games for disfavored treatment, at least when compared to booksellers, cartoonists, and movie producers, and has given no persuasive reason why. Now remember, California is arguing that yes, you should let us censor this type of speech because we're protecting children from violence. And the Supreme Court says that's not really what you're doing. Kids are exposed to violence in many different ways, and you're just picking on one of them. We think you're censoring the video game industry. Next, you may tackle movies. We're not going to let you do that. End of case. For our next lesson, number 7, we're going to take a big leap back in history. Zoning has only existed in this country on a widespread basis for about 90 years, and obviously there were land use conflicts before there was zoning. So how did people resolve those? Well, out in the West where I grew up, sometimes they resolved those with guns. But in more civilized areas, and later even in my part of the country, they solved some of them in court. And we'll look at a lawsuit involving such a land use dispute from that period, involving nuisance law. And then we'll look at a more recent nuisance case where zoning was not adequate to solve the problem, and the parties turned back to law that had mostly been used decades before to solve land use.